The dust storm rolled across the plains like an angry god, a wall of grit and darkness sweeping over the desolate Montana landscape in the summer of 1878, just as Katherine Summers stepped off the stagecoach into the frontier town of Redemption Creek. With nothing but a carpetbag in one hand and a letter from her late father in the other, she surveyed the ramshackle buildings with growing dismay, wondering if she'd made the greatest mistake of her 22 years. The stagecoach driver tossed her second bag to the ground, tipped his hat, and climbed back onto his seat without a word. Katherine brushed the travel dust from her navy blue dress, straightened her spine, and tried to ignore the curious stares from the townspeople who had paused to observe the new arrival. "You must be Thomas Summers' daughter," a gruff voice called out. Katherine turned to see a weathered man in his 60s approaching, his silver mustache impeccably groomed despite his otherwise rough appearance. "Yes, sir. I'm Katherine Summers. Marshal Frank Thornton." He introduced himself with a slight bow. "Your father was a good man. Right sorry about his passing." "Thank you, Marshal." She gripped her bag tighter. "I've come to see to his affairs." The Marshal nodded grimly. "That'll be a challenge, Miss Summers. Your father's ranch is a good 20 miles outside of town, and it ain't in the best condition, I'm afraid." "I'm aware of the difficulties," she replied, though in truth, she'd had no idea it would be quite this remote. Her father's letters had painted a picture of opportunity and prosperity, not this dusty, half-formed town on the edge of nowhere. "You planning to sell it off?" the Marshal asked, eyeing her city clothes with skepticism. "I haven't decided." In truth, she had little choice. Her teaching position in Boston had evaporated when the school board learned of her radical views on women's education. With her reputation tarnished and funds dwindling, her father's unexpected death had presented both tragedy and opportunity. "Well, you'll need someone to take you out there. Ain't safe for a woman alone." Before Katherine could protest this assessment of her capabilities, a commotion erupted from the saloon across the street. The batwing doors burst open, and a man came flying out, propelled by unseen hands. He landed hard in the dusty street, groaning as he rolled onto his back. "Damn you, Callum Westerly," shouted a red-faced man who appeared in the doorway, waving a deck of cards. "You're a cheat and a thief." The man in the dirt, Callum, apparently got to his feet with surprising grace, dusting off his worn denim pants and straightening his leather vest. He stood tall, at least 6 feet, with broad shoulders and a lean frame hardened by outdoor work. His dark brown hair curled slightly beneath his Stetson, and several days' worth of stubble shadowed his tanned face. "I don't cheat, Barker," he replied calmly. "You're just a poor loser." Marshal Thornton sighed heavily. "Excuse me, Miss Summers. Duty calls." He strode toward the confrontation, hand resting on his holstered pistol. Katherine watched as he intervened, separating the two men and speaking in low, authoritative tones. The man called Callum nodded occasionally, then glanced in Katherine's direction. Their eyes met briefly, his a striking blue-green that reminded her of the Atlantic Ocean, before he returned his attention to the Marshal. After a few moments, both men shook hands reluctantly, and the red-faced accuser retreated into the saloon. The Marshal and Callum Westerly approached Katherine, who straightened her posture instinctively. "Miss Summers, this here is Callum Westerly. He's a good hand with horses and knows the territory. He can take you to your father's ranch." Katherine assessed the cowboy skeptically. While undeniably handsome, with his strong jawline and those remarkable eyes, he had just been thrown out of a saloon and accused of cheating at cards. "I'm not sure," she began, but the Marshal cut her off. "Ain't no one else available right now who knows the way. Callum here worked for your father on occasion." Callum tipped his hat. "Madam, sorry about your father. Thomas was a fair man." His voice was deeper than she expected, with a slight roughness that suggested he didn't waste words often. Despite her reservations, Katherine found herself nodding. "When can we leave, Mr. Westerly?" "First light tomorrow," he replied. "Storm's coming in, and we don't want to be caught in the open when it hits." "I'll need supplies." "I'll help you get what you need," he said. "Meet me at the general store in an hour." As Callum walked away, Katherine turned to the Marshal. "Is he trustworthy?" Marshal Thornton stroked his mustache thoughtfully. "Callum's got a past, like most out here, but he's a man of his word. Fights fair, works hard. Been trying to save enough to get his own spread for years." And the accusation of cheating? Barker's a drunk who can't tell a full house from a flush. Don't you worry about that. The marshal pointed to a 2-story building across the street. Mrs. Wilkins runs a clean boarding house. You can stay there tonight. Katherine thanked him and made her way to the boarding house, wondering what her father had been thinking, settling in such a place. The life she'd known in Boston with its libraries, theaters, and society seemed a world away. As she stepped onto the boarding house porch, a gust of wind brought the smell of rain and the low rumble of distant thunder. The storm was getting closer. That night, after a simple meal with Mrs. Wilkins and her other boarders, Katherine sat on her narrow bed reviewing her father's papers. The deed to the ranch showed 640 acres, a full section of land, but the accompanying letter from his neighbor mentioned failed crops, dwindling cattle, and mounting debts. It seemed Thomas Summers' dream of Western prosperity had died long before he did. The next morning dawned gray and threatening. Katherine dressed in her most practical outfit, a brown split riding skirt and white blouse, and packed her few belongings. When she arrived at the general store, Callum was already there, loading supplies into saddlebags. "Morning, Miss Summers," he greeted her, his eyes taking in her riding attire with approval. "You've ridden before?" "Yes, though it's been some time." In fact, she'd only ridden in Boston's public gardens, properly side-saddle with an instructor hovering nearby. Callum seemed to read the truth in her expression. "Well, it'll come back to you. I've got a gentle mare for you. She's steady in rough country." They finished gathering supplies: flour, coffee, beans, salt pork, and ammunition for the rifle Callum insisted she would need. The storekeeper, a wiry man named Jenkins, watched Katherine with undisguised curiosity. Thomas never mentioned a daughter. He commented as she paid for her purchases. "We weren't in regular contact," she admitted. A rift had formed between them after her mother died and her father headed west, leaving 14-year-old Katherine with her maternal aunt in Boston. Their correspondence had been formal and infrequent. "Well, you're braver than most, heading out to that rundown place," Jenkins remarked. "It can't be that bad," Katherine protested. Jenkins and Callum exchanged glances that did nothing to reassure her. Outside, Callum helped her mount a dappled gray mare. "This here's Pepper. She's got a smooth gait and a good temperament." Katherine settled into the saddle, adjusting her skirt and taking the reins. It felt strange after so many years, but her body remembered the basics. Callum mounted his own horse, a powerful chestnut stallion, and they set off at an easy pace. The first few hours passed quietly. They followed a rutted wagon trail that wound through rolling grasslands, occasionally passing small homesteads or grazing cattle. Katherine was struck by the vastness of the landscape, the endless sky, the distant mountains, the sea of grass rippling in the wind. Despite the threatening weather, there was a wild beauty to this land that she couldn't deny. As they rode, she studied Callum Westerly covertly. He sat his horse with the easy confidence of a man who'd spent most of his life in the saddle. His weathered hands held the reins loosely, and his eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, alert to any potential danger. He'd said little since they left town, only occasionally pointing out landmarks or giving brief instructions. "How did you know my father?" she finally asked, breaking the silence. Callum glanced at her. "Worked for him last spring, breaking horses. He had a good eye for horseflesh." "Were you friends?" He considered this. "Not exactly friends, but I respected him. He was trying to make something out here, same as everyone else." The storekeeper made it sound like he wasn't succeeding. Callum was quiet for a moment. "It's hard country, Miss Summers. Takes more than good intentions to make a go of it. Please, call me Katherine." He nodded. "Katherine, then." The sky grew darker as the afternoon wore on, and the wind picked up, bringing with it the smell of rain. Callum looked up at the clouds with concern. "We need to pick up the pace," he said. "That storm's moving faster than I thought." They urged their horses into a trot, Katherine gripping the saddle horn as she bounced uncomfortably. She was already sore from the morning's ride, and each jolt sent pain shooting up her spine. Still, she clenched her jaw and kept going, determined not to show weakness. The first raindrops began to fall an hour later, fat and cold against her skin. Within minutes, the sky opened up, drenching them both. Lightning flashed across the darkened landscape, followed by booming thunder that made the horses skittish. There's an old line shack about a mile ahead, Callum shouted over the storm. We'll take shelter there. Katherine nodded, water streaming down her face. Her clothes were soaked through, clinging uncomfortably to her body, and her fingers were numb around the reins. She followed Callum's lead, trusting him and Pepper to navigate the increasingly slippery terrain. The line shack materialized out of the gloom, a small, crude structure with a sagging roof and weathered walls. Callum dismounted quickly and helped Katherine from her saddle. They led the horses to a lean-to on the side of the shack, where Callum efficiently removed their tack and rubbed them down with an old blanket he found hanging on a nail. Inside, the shack was bare but dry. A small iron stove stood in one corner, and rough bunks lined two walls. Callum immediately set about starting a fire, using kindling from a box near the stove. Katherine stood dripping by the door, suddenly very aware of her wet clothing and the intimate situation. You should get out of those wet clothes, Callum said matter-of-factly, not looking up from the stove. There might be some old clothes in that trunk. Nothing fancy, but they'll be dry. Katherine hesitated, then moved to the wooden trunk he'd indicated. Inside, she found a pair of men's trousers, several flannel shirts, and a worn woolen blanket. She glanced at Callum, who was still occupied with the fire. I'll step outside while you change, he offered, sensing her discomfort. Thank you. When he returned, Katherine had changed into the oversized shirt and trousers. Her wet clothes hung on nails to dry near the now crackling fire. The men's clothing swallowed her slender frame, but the dry fabric was a blessed relief against her chilled skin. She'd loosened her hair from its tight bun, and it hung in damp waves down her back. Callum had also changed into spare clothes from his saddlebag. He busied himself preparing a simple meal of beans and salt pork while Katherine huddled by the fire, watching him surreptitiously. In the confined space of the shack, she couldn't help noticing things about him: the way his hands moved confidently as he worked, the small scar above his right eyebrow, the way his eyes crinkled slightly at the corners. You're staring, he said without looking up, a hint of amusement in his voice. Katherine blushed. I'm sorry. I was just thinking. About what? About what I'm going to do when we reach my father's ranch. Callum set 2 tin plates on a small table. What are your options? Sell it, I suppose. Return to Boston. Even as she said it, Katherine felt a strange reluctance. What was waiting for her in Boston, after all? No teaching position, no family except a distant aunt who had made it clear that at 22, Katherine should be married, not pursuing a career. That what you want to do? I don't know, she admitted. I barely knew my father, and I know nothing about ranching. Callum handed her a plate of beans. Ranching can be learned. Knowing your father. Well, that chance is gone. The simple truth of his words struck her deeply. She ate in silence, listening to the storm raging outside. When they finished eating, Callum washed the plates with water from his canteen, then settled on one of the bunks, his back against the wall. How did you end up out here? Katherine asked, curious about this quiet, capable man. Callum was silent for so long she thought he might not answer. War, he finally said. After Appomattox, I couldn't go back to Virginia. Too many ghosts. Headed west like a lot of other men with nowhere else to go. You fought for the Confederacy. I did. Wasn't about slavery for me, never owned any, never wanted to. It was about defending home. He looked at her directly. But I ain't proud of it now. Seen too much since then. People are just people, trying to get by. Katherine appreciated his honesty. My father left Boston after my mother died. I think he was running from ghosts too. The conversation flowed more easily after that. Callum told her about his years drifting through the territories, working as a cowhand, horse breaker, and occasionally as a scout for the army. Katherine shared stories of her teaching career and her frustration with Boston society's limited view of what women should be. Out here, women do what needs doing, Callum observed. Seen plenty of widows run ranches better than their husbands did. Is that supposed to encourage me? Katherine asked with a small smile. Just saying you wouldn't be the first woman to take on a ranch. Though yours needs a lot of work. How bad is it truly? Callum sighed. Bad enough. Your father's heart wasn't in it anymore. Fences need mending. Cattle count is down to maybe 30 head. Main house is livable, but the outbuildings need repair. He was barely getting by. Katherine stared into the fire, absorbing this bleak assessment. Why didn't he sell it? Pride, maybe. Or hope that things would turn around. Callum studied her face in the firelight. You've got some of the same look in your eyes. Determined. The storm continued through the night. Katherine took one bunk, Callum the other, though she doubted either of them slept much. The confined space, the howling wind, and the uncertain future kept her mind racing. By dawn, the rain had stopped, leaving behind a washed-out landscape and muddy trails. They set off again after a breakfast of coffee and hardtack. The going was slower due to the muddy conditions, but the air was fresh and clean after the storm. By midday, they crested a hill, and Callum reined in his horse. There it is, he said, pointing to the valley below. Summers Ranch. Katherine's heart sank as she surveyed her inheritance. The main house was a modest two-story structure that had once been painted white, but was now weathered to a dull gray. A sagging barn stood nearby, along with several smaller outbuildings in various states of disrepair. A corral held a few horses, and in the distance, she could see cattle scattered across the grassland. It was nothing like the prosperous ranch her father had described in his infrequent letters. It looks, she began, but couldn't find a diplomatic word. Run down, Callum finished for her. But the bones are good. Land's fertile in this valley. Water's reliable from that creek. They rode down to the ranch in silence. As they approached, a weathered man in his 50s emerged from the barn, rifle in hand. He relaxed visibly when he recognized Callum. Westerly, he called out. Didn't expect to see you. Hank, Callum greeted him. This is Miss Katherine Summers, Thomas's daughter. Hank Wilson tipped his hat, eyeing Katherine with surprise. Madam, didn't know Thomas had kin coming. Mr. Wilson, Katherine acknowledged him. I understand you've been looking after things. Doing what I can. Ain't much, with just me and my boy. We've kept the stock watered and fed, but... He gestured vaguely at the deteriorating structures. I appreciate your efforts, she said formally, dismounting with Callum's help. Hank gave her a skeptical once-over, taking in her city-bred appearance despite the borrowed clothes. You planning to stay? For the time being, she replied, not yet ready to commit to more. Hank nodded, though his expression suggested he didn't expect her to last long. I'll have my boy bring your father's papers from the house. As Hank walked away, Katherine turned to Callum. Thank you for bringing me here safely. He nodded, his expression unreadable. I'll help you get settled, then head back to town. A sudden panic gripped Katherine at the thought of being left alone at this desolate place. Would you consider staying a few days? I'll pay you, of course. I just need to assess the situation properly before deciding what to do. Callum studied her for a long moment, those blue-green eyes searching her face. I can stay a week, he finally said. But after that, I've got other commitments. Relief washed over Katherine. Thank you. They spent the remainder of the day taking inventory of the ranch. The main house was sturdy but neglected, with dust-covered furniture and sparse personal belongings. Thomas Summers had lived simply, with few comforts. Katherine found herself searching for traces of her father in this unfamiliar space, a book he might have read, a chair where he might have sat, but he remained as much a stranger in death as he had in life. Hank's son, Jesse, a gangly young man of about 19, brought a box of papers and ledgers. These were Mr. Summers' business records, he explained. Pa said you'd want to see them. Katherine thanked him and spent the evening at the kitchen table, poring over the documents by lamplight while Callum repaired a broken window shutter. The financial picture was even bleaker than she'd expected. Her father had been borrowing against the property for years, and the outstanding debts nearly equaled its value. The most recent entries showed declining cattle sales and mounting expenses for feed and equipment repairs. It's worse than I thought, she admitted when Callum came in from his work. He was barely staying afloat. Callum leaned against the doorframe. Most small ranches are struggling these days. Big operations are buying up land, driving prices down. Then selling is my only option. Probably, he agreed. Though you won't get much in this market. Katherine rubbed her temples, feeling a headache forming. I need to at least try to increase the value before selling. Make repairs, perhaps build up the herd a bit. That takes money. I have some savings, she said, though the amount seemed pitiful against the ranch's needs. And I can work. Callum's lips quirked in what might have been a suppressed smile. You ever mended a fence, Miss Summers? Branded a calf? Mucked out a stall? Her chin came up at his skeptical tone. I'm a quick learner, Mr. Westerly, and I'm not afraid of hard work. No, I don't expect you are, he said, more seriously. But ranching isn't just hard work, it's knowing the land, the weather, the cattle. It's skills passed down or learned over years, not days. Then I'll hire someone who knows, she countered. Someone to teach me while helping with the work. Their eyes met in the lamplight, a challenge passing between them. Finally, Callum nodded. I know someone, he said. Me? Katherine blinked in surprise. But you said you had other commitments. I do, but they can wait a bit longer. He straightened from the doorframe. I'll help you get this place in order enough to sell. For a fair wage and a share if you make a profit. Why? She asked, suddenly suspicious. What's your interest in this run-down ranch? Callum's expression softened slightly. Your father gave me a chance when others wouldn't. Figure I owe him this much. He paused. And I've been saving for my own place. The experience won't hurt. Katherine considered his offer. Having Callum stay would certainly make the daunting task ahead seem more manageable. And despite her initial reservations, she'd come to trust his judgment and appreciate his quiet competence. All right, Mr. Westerly. You have a deal. The next morning, Katherine woke at dawn to find Callum already outside, assessing the corral fence. She'd slept in her father's bedroom, surrounded by his sparse belongings, feeling like an intruder in his life. After washing her face in cold water, she dressed in her riding skirt and blouse, then headed outside, determined to begin learning what needed to be done. First thing is getting those cattle counted and checked, Callum told her when she approached. We need to know exactly what we're working with. I'll come with you, she said immediately. He raised an eyebrow. It's hard riding. I need to learn. Callum studied her for a moment, then nodded. Get changed first. You can't work cattle in that skirt. There's probably some old clothes in the house that would fit you better than those borrowed trousers. In her father's trunk, Katherine found work clothes that had likely belonged to a ranch hand, faded denims, flannel shirts, and a worn leather vest. They were too large, but with a piece of rope as a belt and the sleeves rolled up, they would serve. She braided her long auburn hair tightly and jammed a battered hat onto her head, then surveyed herself in the cracked mirror. The transformation was shocking. The proper Boston schoolteacher had vanished, replaced by a frontier woman ready for work. When she emerged from the house, Callum did a double take, then gave her an approving nod. That'll work better, he said, handing her a pair of leather gloves. You'll need these. They spent the morning on horseback, combing the property for cattle. Katherine's muscles screamed in protest after yesterday's long ride, but she gritted her teeth and kept going. Callum was patient, showing her how to approach the animals, how to read their behavior, how to move them together into a manageable herd. By midday, they had counted 28 head of cattle, far fewer than the 100 or more needed for a viable ranch. The animals were thin but healthy, a testament to Hank Wilson's care during Thomas Summers' decline and after his death. We could build the herd, Callum observed as they paused on a ridge overlooking the valley. Good grazing here. With proper management, you could double the number in a year or two. That's too long, Katherine replied, wiping sweat from her brow. I need to sell before winter. Why the rush? She hesitated, reluctant to share her precarious financial situation. I have obligations in Boston. Callum seemed to sense her reticence and didn't press further. Well, we can still improve things enough to get a better price. Repair the barn and corral, get the house in better shape, make sure the cattle are in good condition for sale. As they rode back to the ranch house, Katherine found herself studying the land with new eyes. The valley was beautiful, with its meandering creek, rolling grasslands, and the distant purple mountains. In different circumstances, she might have appreciated the wild beauty of this place, might even have considered staying. But the practicalities of her situation, her dwindling funds, her lack of experience, the ranch's poor condition made such thoughts foolish. The next few days fell into a rhythm of hard work from dawn to dusk. Katherine's soft hands blistered and then calloused as she learned to mend fences, repair gates, and help with the daily chores of ranch life. Callum was a patient teacher, showing her the proper way to hold tools, how to approach the horses, how to read the weather from the sky and wind. You're a quick study, he commented one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the valley in gold and crimson. Katherine was exhausted but satisfied with the day's progress. They'd repaired the barn roof and organized her father's scattered tools, bringing a small measure of order to the chaos. "I've always been good at learning new things," she replied, flexing her sore hands. "Though I admit, I never expected to be learning ranching." "What did you expect to be doing at this point in your life?" Katherine smiled wryly. "Teaching literature to young ladies, inspiring them to think beyond the limitations society places on women. Perhaps writing scholarly articles, or even a book." "Noble ambitions," Callum said, and she was surprised to hear genuine respect in his voice. "What about you?" she asked. "What are you working toward?" He was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "Land of my own," he finally said. "Somewhere I can build something lasting. Something that's mine." The simple honesty of his answer touched her. "That's not so different from what I wanted. A place to belong, to make my mark." Their eyes met in the fading light, and Katherine felt a strange flutter in her chest. In that moment, she realized that despite their different backgrounds and experiences, they shared something fundamental: a desire to carve out their own place in the world on their own terms. The moment was broken by the sound of approaching horses. They both stood as two riders came into view, making their way up the ranch road. Katherine tensed, but Callum seemed unconcerned. "That'll be Hank and Jesse," he said, "probably bringing supplies from town." But as the riders drew closer, Callum's expression changed. "That's not Hank," he muttered, stepping slightly in front of Katherine. The two men who rode up to the house were strangers to Katherine, one heavy set with a bushy beard, the other thin and wiry with a pockmarked face. Both wore dusty clothes and had revolvers holstered at their hips. "Evening," the bearded man called out, his voice falsely jovial. "This the Summers place?" "It is," Callum replied evenly. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" "Hope so." The man dismounted, his companion following suit. "Name's Harlan Reeves. This here's my associate, Jimmy Stokes. We represent Mr. Edgar Blackwell of the Black Diamond Ranch." Katherine felt Callum stiffen beside her, though his expression remained neutral. "Mr. Blackwell sent us to discuss a business proposition with the new owner," Reeves continued, his gaze shifting to Katherine. "I take it that's you, madam?" "I'm Katherine Summers," she confirmed, stepping forward despite Callum's subtle attempt to keep her behind him. "What proposition?" Reeves smiled, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. "Mr. Blackwell is interested in purchasing your property. He's prepared to make a generous offer: $3,000 for the land and all improvements." Katherine knew enough about local prices now to recognize this as a lowball offer, barely covering the existing debts. "That's very kind, but I'm not ready to sell just yet." Reeves's smile faltered. "Mr. Blackwell is eager to consolidate his holdings in this valley. All your neighbors have already sold to him." "Not all," Callum interjected quietly. Reeves shot him a cold look. "Westerly, didn't recognize you at first. Still playing cowboy instead of accepting the inevitable." "Still minding my own business," Callum replied. "Suggest you do the same." The tension between the men was palpable. Katherine stepped forward, attempting to defuse the situation. "Please tell Mr. Blackwell I appreciate his interest, but I need time to consider my options." "Time is money, Miss Summers," Reeves said, his friendly tone evaporating. "And ranching is a dangerous business for those who don't know what they're doing. Accidents happen. Cattle stray. Fires start." The thinly veiled threat hung in the air. Callum moved closer to Katherine, his hand drifting toward the pistol at his hip. "I think you gentlemen should leave now." Reeves and Stokes exchanged glances, then slowly remounted their horses. "Think carefully about Mr. Blackwell's offer, Miss Summers," Reeves said. "It won't stay open indefinitely." They rode away, leaving Katherine shaken. "Who is this Blackwell?" Callum's expression was grim. "Cattle baron from Wyoming. Been buying up small ranches all through this territory, sometimes by fair means, sometimes not. He's been after my place too." "You have a ranch?" This was the first Katherine had heard of it. "Small spread, about 10 miles east of here. Nothing fancy, but it's mine. Paid for it with 6 years of savings." Pride colored his voice. "Blackwell wants it because it controls access to the high country grazing lands. And my father's ranch. Water rights. The creek that runs through your property is the most reliable water source in the valley." Katherine frowned, thinking through the implications. "So this land is more valuable than it appears." "To the right buyer, yes." Callum's gaze followed the departing riders. Problem is, Blackwell doesn't like taking no for an answer. Do you think they were serious about their threats? Serious enough that we should be careful. He turned to her, his expression softening. But don't worry. I won't let anything happen to you or this ranch while I'm here. The unexpected protectiveness in his voice sent warmth through Catherine's chest. Thank you. That night, she found it hard to sleep, her mind spinning with new information and concerns. The ranch, which had seemed like a burden to be quickly shed, now represented something more complicated. If Blackwell wanted it badly enough to send men with veiled threats, perhaps she should reconsider her plans to sell quickly. And then there was Callum Westerly, becoming more of an enigma with each passing day. He presented himself as a drifting cowhand, but now she learned he was a landowner himself, fighting the same battle against Blackwell's expansion. She wondered what else she didn't know about him, and why the thought of him leaving once their arrangement ended filled her with an unexpected sense of loss. The next morning brought news from town. Hank Wilson rode in at dawn with supplies and a worried expression. Edgar Blackwell had arrived in Redemption Creek with a dozen men, taking rooms at the hotel and making it known he intended to acquire the remaining independent ranches in the valley. He's putting pressure on folks who do business with holdouts, Hank explained as they unloaded supplies in the kitchen. Already told Jenkins at the general store he'd better not sell to you or Westerly if he knows what's good for him. He can't do that, Katherine protested. That's illegal. Hank and Callum exchanged knowing looks. Law works different out here, Miss Summers, Hank said gently. Marshall Thornton is just one man, and Blackwell has money and influence. So we just give up? Katherine demanded, anger rising in her chest. Let this man bully us into selling land that's rightfully ours. Not saying that, Hank replied. Just saying it won't be easy standing against him. Callum had been quiet during this exchange, but now he spoke up. We need allies. Other small ranchers who haven't sold yet. Not many left, Hank said grimly. The Johnsons sold last month after their well dried up. The Martinez family headed back to Texas after Blackwell's men stampeded their cattle. What about the Douglas place? And old Sam Tucker? Still holding out, far as I know. Tucker's too ornery to sell, and Douglas has his sons to help defend the place. Katherine listened to this exchange with growing determination. We should talk to them. Form an alliance. Both men looked at her in surprise. Callum's expression shifted from shock to something like admiration. It's not a bad idea, he acknowledged. Blackwell preys on isolated ranchers. Together, we might stand a chance. I'll ride to the Douglas ranch today, Katherine declared. Explain the situation. Not alone, you won't, Callum said firmly. Blackwell's men are watching the roads. Then we'll go together. And so they did, setting out mid-morning after arming themselves, Callum with his revolver and rifle, Katherine with a shotgun he insisted she learn to use. The Douglas ranch lay about 15 miles to the north, a journey that would take most of the day round trip. As they rode, Katherine found herself watching Callum with new interest. In profile against the vast Montana sky, he cut an impressive figure, tall and straight in the saddle, alert to their surroundings, his face weathered by sun and wind. When had she started finding him not just handsome but compelling? You're staring again, he said without looking at her, that same hint of amusement in his voice that she'd heard in the line shack. Katherine felt heat rise to her cheeks but decided not to deny it. I'm trying to figure you out, Callum Westerly. You're not what I expected. What did you expect? I'm not sure. A simple cowhand, I suppose. Not a landowner fighting his own battle against men like Blackwell. Callum was quiet for a moment. Most folks out here are fighting some kind of battle. Mine just happens to be more visible than most. Why is your land so important to you? Important enough to risk confrontation with a powerful man like Blackwell. He rode silently for so long that Katherine thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but intense. After the war, I had nothing. No home to go back to. No family left. No purpose. I drifted for years, taking whatever work I could find, sleeping under the stars more often than not. He paused, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The day I signed the papers for that piece of land was the first time since Appomattox that I felt like a whole man again. It's not just property to me, it's proof that I can build something good after all the destruction I was part of. The raw honesty of his words touched Katherine deeply. She understood now why he couldn't simply sell and move on, as she had planned to do. For Callum, that land represented redemption. "Then we'll fight for it," she said simply. "For your land and for mine." He glanced at her, surprise and something warmer in his eyes. "You've changed your mind about selling?" "I'm reconsidering my options," she admitted. "This land was important to my father. Perhaps I should understand why before I give it up." They reached the Douglas Ranch by early afternoon. James Douglas, a gruff man in his 50s with 3 grown sons, welcomed them cautiously but warmed when they explained their purpose. The Douglases had already been approached by Blackwell's men and had similarly refused to sell. "Been on this land 20 years, Douglas said as they gathered around his kitchen table. "Raised my boys here, buried my wife here. I'll be damned if I'll let some Wyoming cattle baron run me off." His oldest son, Matthew, was more pragmatic. "Pa, we can't fight Blackwell's whole crew. He's got at least 20 men, and they're well armed. That's why we need to stand together," Katherine argued. "If the remaining independent ranchers unite, we present a more difficult target." The discussion continued for hours, strategizing ways to protect their properties and resist Blackwell's pressure tactics. By the time Katherine and Callum prepared to leave, they had the beginnings of an alliance. The Douglases would spread the word to other holdouts, arranging a meeting at the Summers Ranch in 3 days' time. The sun was low in the sky as they started the journey home, casting long shadows across the rolling grasslands. Katherine felt a new sense of purpose energizing her despite the physical exhaustion of the past days. For the first time since arriving in Montana, she was doing something that felt meaningful, something her father might have approved of. They were about halfway back to the ranch when Callum suddenly reined in his horse, holding up a hand for Katherine to stop. His posture had tensed, and his eyes scanned the landscape intently. "What is it?" she whispered, immediately alert. "Riders," he murmured, pointing to a distant ridge where 3 horsemen were silhouetted against the darkening sky. "Coming from the direction of your ranch. Blackwell's men. Likely, they're keeping tabs on us." He considered their options. "We should take the creek route back. More cover." They altered course, following a line of cottonwood trees that marked the winding path of the creek through the valley. The detour would add time to their journey, but the trees and undergrowth provided concealment from watching eyes. As they rode, the sky darkened further, and a chill crept into the air. "We'll be riding after dark," Callum observed, glancing at the fading light. "Is that dangerous?" "Can be, but I know this land well enough." He looked at her with concern. "You holding up all right?" Katherine was saddle-sore and exhausted, but she nodded firmly. "I'm fine." His lips quirked in a half-smile. "You're tougher than you look, Katherine Summers." "I'll take that as a compliment, Mr. Westerly." It was meant as one. They rode in companionable silence as darkness fell. The moon rose, nearly full, casting silver light across the landscape and making navigation possible. Katherine found herself hyper-aware of Callum's presence beside her, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the occasional brush of his leg against hers when the trail narrowed, the reassuring solidity of him in the darkness. When the ranch house finally came into view, its windows dark against the night sky, Katherine felt a complex mix of relief and disappointment. Relief at having reached safety, disappointment that this time alone with Callum was ending. They approached cautiously, alert for any sign of intruders, but the ranch appeared undisturbed. Callum insisted on checking the outbuildings before they dismounted, rifle at the ready as he moved from structure to structure. Only when he was satisfied did he help Katherine from her horse. "Everything looks secure," he reported as they led the tired animals to the barn. "But Blackwell knows we're organizing. Things will get more difficult from here." Katherine nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation they faced. As they tended to the horses in the lantern-lit barn, she found herself watching Callum's hands, strong, capable hands that moved with gentle efficiency as he removed saddles and brushed down the animals. Hands that had shown her how to mend fences, how to handle tools, how to defend herself. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything you've done." He glanced up, caught by the emotion in her voice. In the warm glow of the lantern, his eyes seemed to hold depths she hadn't noticed before. "Just keeping my word," he replied, but his voice had roughened slightly. Katherine stepped closer, drawn by something she couldn't name. Is that all it is? An obligation? Callum stilled, his gaze holding hers. No, he admitted quietly. Not anymore. The air between them seemed charged with possibility. Katherine was acutely aware of her racing heart, of the small space separating them, of the way Callum's eyes dropped briefly to her lips before meeting her gaze again. "Katherine," he began, his voice husky with restraint. "You should know I'm not the kind of man a woman like you." She didn't let him finish, closing the distance between them and pressing her lips to his. For an instant, he remained frozen in surprise. Then his arms came around her, pulling her against him as he deepened the kiss. His mouth was warm and insistent on hers, his hands strong at her waist, and Katherine felt something inside her unfurl like a flower opening to the sun. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Callum rested his forehead against hers. "That was—" he began, then seemed at a loss for words. "Unexpected," she supplied, a smile curving her lips. "Wonderful," he corrected, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear with gentle fingers. "But complicated." Reality intruded on the moment, their precarious situation, the threat of Blackwell, the uncertain future. Katherine stepped back slightly, though she kept her hands on his arms, unwilling to break contact entirely. "Life is complicated," she said. "That doesn't mean we shouldn't take what happiness we can find." Callum studied her face in the lantern light, his expression a mixture of desire and concern. "You deserve better than a scarred ex-Confederate with nothing but a small piece of land to his name." "I deserve to make my own choices," she countered firmly. "And I choose you, Callum Westerly, however complicated that might be." He pulled her close again, his kiss softer this time, but no less passionate. In the quiet of the barn, with only the horses as witnesses, Katherine felt as though she'd found something she hadn't known. She was seeking a connection that transcended the boundaries of their different backgrounds and experiences. The next 3 days passed in a blur of activity as they prepared for the meeting of the independent ranchers. By day, they worked side by side, repairing the ranch and making it defensible against potential threats. By night, they talked for hours on the porch or by the fireplace, sharing stories of their pasts and tentative dreams for the future. And in the moments between, they discovered each other with increasing intimacy, kisses stolen during chores, hands lingering in casual touches, heated glances across rooms. Katherine found herself changing in ways she couldn't have anticipated. The physical labor was transforming her body, building strength and muscles she hadn't known she possessed. The challenges of ranch life were honing her mind, teaching her to think practically and decisively. And her growing feelings for Callum were opening her heart to possibilities she'd never considered. The day of the meeting arrived clear and cool, with a hint of autumn in the air. 7 ranching families gathered at the Summers Ranch, representing the last holdouts against Blackwell's expansion. They were a diverse group, weathered pioneers like James Douglas, a Norwegian immigrant family named Olsen, Sam Tucker with his trademark scowl, the widow Carson and her teenage son, and 2 bachelor brothers named Reed who ran a small horse ranch to the west. Katherine welcomed them in her father's house, serving coffee and the fresh bread she'd learned to bake under Mrs. Wilson's guidance. As the group settled around the large kitchen table, Katherine felt a momentary flutter of doubt. Who was she to lead these experienced ranchers? But then Callum caught her eye from across the room, his quiet confidence bolstering her own. "Thank you all for coming," she began. "I know many of you knew my father, and I appreciate the respect you've shown by answering our call." Old Sam Tucker squinted at her suspiciously. "Thomas never mentioned no daughter. How do we know you ain't just working for Blackwell, trying to get us all in one place?" Before Katherine could respond, James Douglas spoke up. "She rode all the way to my place to warn us about Blackwell's plans, Sam. If she's working for him, she's doing a poor job of it." There were chuckles around the table, and the tension eased slightly. Katherine nodded gratefully to Douglas. "I may be new to ranching and to Montana, but I understand what's at stake here. My father built this place with his own hands, just as each of you built yours. I won't dishonor his memory by surrendering it without a fight." Callum stepped forward. "Blackwell is counting on picking us off one by one. Together, we stand a better chance." The discussion that followed was passionate and occasionally heated. Some, like Tucker, argued for armed resistance. Others, like the widow Carson, favored legal approaches through the territorial courts. The Olsons suggested attempting to negotiate with Blackwell as a unified group, potentially securing better terms than any individual rancher could get. As Katherine listened, a plan began to form in her mind, not an either slash or approach, but a combination of strategies that would maximize their leverage. When there was a lull in the conversation, she cleared her throat. "I believe we need to pursue multiple avenues simultaneously," she said, her teacher's voice emerging naturally as she outlined her thoughts. "Legal action to establish our water rights clearly. United negotiation to demonstrate our resolve. And yes, preparation to defend our properties if necessary, though I pray it won't come to that." Her clear, logical presentation impressed even the skeptical Tucker. By the end of the meeting, they had formed the Valley Ranchers Association, with each member pledging mutual aid and support. Douglas would ride to the territorial capital to file legal papers. The Reeds would organize a patrol system to watch for Blackwell's men. And Katherine, to her surprise, was chosen to lead the negotiation committee, along with Callum and Mrs. Olson. As the ranchers departed, a sense of cautious optimism prevailed. They faced a powerful opponent, but they were no longer facing him alone. Katherine stood on the porch, waving goodbye to the last wagon, when Callum joined her, slipping an arm around her waist. "You were impressive in there," he said, pride evident in his voice. A natural leader. She leaned against him, savoring his warmth in the cool evening air. "I was terrified, but I kept thinking about what my father would have wanted not just for this land, but for me. He came west seeking independence, the freedom to build something of his own. I'm beginning to understand that drive." Callum studied her face. "Does that mean you're considering staying?" "I'm considering many things I wouldn't have thought possible 2 weeks ago," she replied, meeting his gaze meaningfully. His arms tightened around her, and he lowered his head to kiss her, a kiss full of promise and growing certainty. But before their lips met, the sound of approaching horses broke the moment. They turned to see 3 riders approaching at a gallop: Hank Wilson and his son, accompanied by Matthew Douglas. The men reined in sharply at the house, their expressions grim. "Blackwell's making his move," Matthew reported without preamble. "His men burned down Tucker's barn this afternoon. Tucker shot one of them, and now Blackwell's gathered his whole crew, threatening to make an example of anyone who resists." "Where's Tucker now?" Callum demanded. "Holed up in his cabin. The Reeds are with him." Matthew dismounted, his movements urgent. "Pa sent me to warn everyone. He's gathering men to stand with Tucker." Katherine felt cold fear grip her heart. The peaceful resolution she'd hoped for was evaporating before her eyes. "How many men does Blackwell have?" 20, maybe more," Hank replied. "Well armed." Callum's expression hardened. "We can't let him start picking us off. If Tucker falls, we all do." "I'll go to town," Katherine decided. "Talk to Marshal Thornton. This is exactly the kind of lawlessness he's sworn to prevent." "Thornton's 1 man against 20, Hank pointed out. "And Blackwell's already got half the town intimidated." "Then I'll find the other half," Katherine insisted. "There must be townspeople who don't want to see Blackwell take over everything." Callum hesitated, clearly torn between staying to defend the ranch and going with Katherine. "It's too dangerous for you to go alone," he finally said. "Jesse can go with her," Hank offered. "My boy knows the back trails to town. They can avoid Blackwell's patrols." And so it was decided. Katherine changed quickly into her riding clothes, strapping on the revolver Callum had taught her to use. As she prepared to leave, Callum pulled her aside, his expression intense. "Be careful," he said, his voice low and urgent. "If there's any sign of trouble, turn back immediately." "I will," she promised. "You be careful too. Don't do anything foolish." His smile was grim. "Like stand against 20 armed men? Too late for that." Katherine placed a hand on his cheek, suddenly terrified this might be the last time she saw him. "I need you to survive this, Callum Westerly. We have unfinished business." He turned his face to press a kiss into her palm. "Count on it." Then, more softly, "I love you, Katherine Summers." Should have said it before now. The words sent a shock through her system, followed by a wave of warmth. "I love you too," she replied, the truth of it resonating through her entire being. "And I'll tell you again when this is over." Their kiss was brief but fierce, a promise and a prayer combined. Then Katherine mounted Pepper, and she and Jesse Wilson rode off into the gathering darkness, taking the hidden trails toward Redemption Creek. The journey to town was tense, every shadow potentially harboring Blackwell's men. Jesse proved a capable guide, leading them through ravines and wooded areas where they could travel unseen. They reached Redemption Creek well after midnight, the town mostly dark except for the saloon and the hotel where Blackwell and his men were staying. Marshal Thornton was asleep in the small room behind his office, but he came fully alert when Katherine explained the situation. "Been expecting something like this," he admitted, buckling on his gun belt. "Blackwell's been pushing the boundaries since he arrived. Will you help us?" Katherine asked directly. The marshal's weathered face was solemn. "It's my job to uphold the law, Miss Summers. Burning barns and threatening homesteaders definitely falls outside that law." But it quickly became clear that Thornton, though willing, had limited options. The town had no deputy, and when they approached several townsmen for help, most declined, citing fear of Blackwell's retribution. By dawn, they had managed to recruit only 4 men: the blacksmith, a retired Army sergeant, the bartender, and surprisingly, Jenkins the storekeeper. "Blackwell threatened to burn my store if I kept selling to you folks," Jenkins explained grimly. "Man like that doesn't stop with ranchers. Today it's you. Tomorrow it's anyone who crosses him." It was a small force, 6 against Blackwell's 20, but it was better than nothing. As they prepared to ride out, Katherine felt a mixture of determination and dread. The confrontation that was coming could end in bloodshed, perhaps even the death of the man she had unexpectedly come to love. "Miss Summers," Marshal Thornton said quietly as they mounted up, "you should stay in town. This could get ugly." Katherine shook her head firmly. "My ranch, my fight, Marshal. Besides, I'm a fair shot now, thanks to Callum." The Marshal studied her for a moment, then nodded with reluctant respect. "Your father would be proud." They rode hard, taking the main road rather than the back trails, speed now more important than stealth. As they crested a hill overlooking Tucker's ranch, Katherine's heart sank. Smoke rose from several buildings, and riders could be seen moving in the distance. The confrontation had already begun. "We need to hurry," Thornton urged, spurring his horse forward. As they approached, the situation became clearer. Blackwell's men had surrounded Tucker's cabin, where a group of defenders were holed up. Occasional gunfire erupted from both sides, but it appeared to be a standoff for the moment. On a nearby ridge, Katherine spotted Callum and several other ranchers, positioned to provide covering fire for those in the cabin. Marshal Thornton didn't hesitate. He rode straight toward the center of the conflict, his badge visible on his chest. "This is United States Marshal Frank Thornton," he shouted in a voice that carried across the landscape. "Cease fire immediately." The gunfire stuttered to a halt as both sides registered the arrival of the law. A large man with a neatly trimmed beard emerged from the group of attackers, riding forward to meet Thornton. This, Katherine presumed, was Edgar Blackwell himself. "Marshal," Blackwell greeted him, his tone falsely cordial. "This is a private dispute between me and some trespassers on my property." "Funny, I don't recall seeing any deeds transferring ownership," Thornton replied coolly. "What I do see is armed men attacking legitimate homesteaders. That's against the law in this territory." As the two men faced off, Katherine and the small group from town moved to join the ranchers on the ridge. Callum's face showed momentary shock when he saw her, then fierce approval. He quickly filled her in on what had happened. Blackwell's men had attacked Tucker at dawn, burning his outbuildings. The other ranchers had responded to Tucker's signal fire, arriving in time to prevent the cabin itself from being torched. "We've been holding them off, but we're outnumbered," Callum explained. "Tucker's wounded, not badly, but it's made Blackwell bolder." Below them, the confrontation between Blackwell and Thornton was growing heated. Blackwell's men had begun to spread out, taking positions that looked increasingly threatening. The Marshal stood his ground, but it was clear he was in a precarious position. "We need to show Blackwell he's outnumbered now," Katherine decided. "Everyone, move down toward the Marshal. Make sure they can see we're armed." The ranchers and townsmen followed her lead, emerging from cover and moving to support Thornton. It was a calculated risk. Blackwell's men still had the advantage in numbers, but the psychological impact was immediate. Blackwell's confident posture faltered as he registered the new arrivals. "This doesn't concern you folks," he called out to the townsmen. Go back to Redemption Creek and mind your business." Jenkins stepped forward, shotgun in hand. "Our business is seeing the law upheld, Blackwell. You threatened my store. You threatened our neighbors. That makes it our business." Murmurs of agreement came from the other townsmen. Blackwell's face darkened with anger, but Katherine could see calculation in his eyes as well. He was reassessing the situation, counting the cost of a battle that had suddenly become much less one-sided. "Tucker shot one of my men," Blackwell argued, but his tone had lost some of its certainty. "After your men set fire to his property," Thornton countered. "Self-defense is recognized by the law. Arson and intimidation are not." Katherine moved forward to stand beside the marshal. "Mr. Blackwell," she said clearly, "the independent ranchers of this valley have formed an association. We've filed legal papers establishing our water rights and property boundaries. We've also documented the threats and illegal actions taken by your men." This was stretching the truth. Douglas hadn't yet reached the territorial capital with their paperwork, but Blackwell didn't know that. She continued, gaining confidence as she spoke. "We're prepared to negotiate fair terms if you wish to purchase any of our properties. But we will not be bullied or threatened into selling." Callum joined her, his presence solid and reassuring at her side. "That goes for all of us," he added, his voice carrying across the tense gathering. "You want war, Blackwell, you'll get it. But ask yourself if a few thousand acres are worth the blood that'll spill, including yours." A heavy silence fell over the scene. Blackwell's men looked to their employer, waiting for direction. The moment balanced on a knife's edge, it could still tip toward violence with a single word or gesture. Then Blackwell laughed, a short, harsh sound without humor. "Well played, Miss Summers," he acknowledged. "Perhaps I underestimated the resolve of you small ranchers." He turned to Marshal Thornton. "My men and I will return to town. But this isn't over. As long as you stay within the law, you're free to conduct your business," Thornton replied evenly. "Step outside it again, and you'll answer to me and the territorial court." Blackwell gathered his men and departed, leaving behind smoldering outbuildings and a palpable sense of relief among the defenders. It wasn't a complete victory. Blackwell would undoubtedly try other tactics, but the immediate threat had passed. In the aftermath, wounds were tended, damage was assessed, and plans were made for rebuilding Tucker's barn. The Valley Ranchers Association had passed its first test, standing together against a common threat. As the adrenaline of confrontation faded, Katherine found herself unexpectedly emotional, the weight of what might have happened hitting her all at once. Callum found her sitting alone on Tucker's porch steps, staring out at the smoke-stained landscape. He settled beside her, his shoulder pressing reassuringly against hers. "You were magnificent," he said softly. "Facing down Blackwell like that. Where did you learn to be so fearless?" Katherine smiled wearily. "I was terrified. But sometimes you have to stand up for what matters, even when you're afraid." "And what matters to you, Katherine Summers?" She turned to face him fully, taking in the strong lines of his face, the warmth in his eyes, the quiet strength that had become her anchor in this wild new world. "You," she said simply. "This land. The life we could build here together." Callum's expression softened with wonder. "You're staying then?" "Yes," she replied, the decision feeling right in her bones. "This place gets under your skin. And so do you, Callum Westerly." He took her hands in his touch gentle despite the calluses earned through years of hard work. "I meant what I said before the fight. I love you, Katherine. Never expected to find someone like you out here, but now that I have, I can't imagine going back to life without you." "Then don't," she whispered, leaning closer. "My father's ranch needs work. So does yours, I imagine. Perhaps we could help each other." His smile was slow and sweet. "Are you proposing a merger, Miss Summers?" "I'm proposing whatever will keep you by my side," she replied honestly. "Business, pleasure, marriage, if you're so inclined." Callum's eyes widened at her boldness, then crinkled with joy. "I am definitely so inclined," he murmured, pulling her into his arms. His kiss was tender at first, then deepening with promise as she responded eagerly. When they finally parted, breathless and smiling, he rested his forehead against hers. "People will talk, you know. The Boston schoolteacher and the ex-Confederate cowboy. Let them talk," Katherine said, her heart full. "We'll be too busy building our life to listen." 1 year later, the Summers Westerly Ranch stood transformed. The buildings were repaired and freshly painted. The cattle herd had doubled, and new fencing enclosed expanded grazing lands. The Valley Ranchers Association had successfully defended their water rights in territorial court, forcing Edgar Blackwell to negotiate fair prices when he wanted to purchase land rather than simply taking it. Katherine stood on the porch of what was now their home, watching as Callum worked with a young colt in the corral. Her hand rested lightly on her rounded belly, where their first child grew, a testament to the future they were building together. The Boston schoolteacher had become a capable ranch wife, though she still found time to teach at the small school the association had established for the ranchers' children. Her father's legacy lived on not just in the land he had claimed, but in the community that had formed to protect it. Callum looked up, sensing her gaze, and waved. He finished his work with the colt and strode toward the house, his face lighting with the smile he reserved only for her. As he climbed the porch steps, Katherine remembered their journey to this moment, the doubt, the danger, the unexpected love that had blossomed in the most unlikely of places. "Happy?" he asked, placing a hand over hers on her belly. "Completely," she replied, leaning into his embrace. "You know, when I first arrived, Hank told me I'd never make it out here." Callum chuckled, remembering. "And I told him to watch me bring you home." "You did exactly that," Katherine said softly, lifting her face for his kiss. "You brought me home to a place I never knew I was looking for." As the sun set over their valley, painting the Montana sky in gold and crimson, Katherine Summers Westerly knew with absolute certainty that she had found where she belonged, not in the refined salons of Boston, but here in the wild heart of the West, with a man who had shown her the true meaning of home.